Men who walk the seafloor for 10 minutes on a single breath, as if they were born with gills. Villages where the drinking water carries enough poison to kill anyone else on Earth. People with hearts so clean at 80 that doctors mistake them for men half their age, and tribes who have survived in places where you or I wouldn't last a single season. This is a world of living anomalies, and today we're going to meet the tribes that terrify modern science. For the Bajau, 60 meters down on a single breath is just Tuesday. Spear in hand, walking the seafloor, holding air for 8 to 13 minutes at a stretch. An elite freediver who trains for years might reach 4 minutes on a good day, and that's with equipment and a support crew. The Bajau never trained for this in any formal sense. Their bodies were shaped for it long before anyone thought to measure it. In 2015, a team of researchers in Copenhagen scanned Bajau spleens and found them almost 60% larger than average. Seals have that kind of spleen. So do otters. It works like a biological air tank. Squeeze it, and a reserve of oxygen-rich blood cells floods the system right when the body needs it most. There's a gene involved too, PDE10A, which appears to trigger in humans something evolution had already worked out in seals millions of years earlier. Even the children's eyes adjust, pupils constrict underwater, sharpening vision in conditions where most of us see nothing but blur and shadow. Some of the older divers used to pierce their own eardrums deliberately, young, just so the pressure would stop fighting them on every single dive for the rest of their lives. Move a Bajau family onto land though and give it 2 generations, not 20, 2, and the spleen starts shrinking back down. The underwater vision fades. The reflexes that used to fire the instant a child hit the water go quiet. Whatever 1,000 years built underwater, 2 generations on dry ground can start undoing. Keep that in mind, because by the end of this list, you'll meet a tribe whose read of the ocean saved an entire community from the deadliest wave of this century, while every early warning system built by modern science missed it completely. Take an ordinary, healthy person and put them above 4,000 meters. The body panics in a very specific way. It starts pumping out extra red blood cells, grabbing for more oxygen out of thin air. Sounds like a reasonable response. It isn't, really. Blood that thick moves sluggishly, and it's a big part of why mountaineers die of stroke and heart failure at altitude, season after season. Sherpa and Tibetan physiology does something close to the opposite. Hemoglobin stays low even at extreme elevation, which on paper should mean less oxygen available to work with. Instead, their bodies simply use what oxygen they have far more efficiently, and blood keeps flowing the way it's supposed to. The gene responsible is EPAS1, and this is where the story turns genuinely strange. Researchers traced part of it back to the Denisovans, an ancient human relative that vanished roughly 40,000 years ago. At some point in the deep past, a Denisovan and a modern human ancestor had children together, and that gene never left the population, because at high altitude, it was the difference between living and not. One version of the gene now appears in Tibetan populations more than 70% more often than in neighboring lowland groups. Geneticists have called it one of the fastest documented cases of genetic change in humans, not over millions of years, but in what amounts to an evolutionary blink. The Andes solved the altitude problem one way. The Himalayas solved it with a gift from a species that no longer exists anywhere else on Earth, except, quietly, inside the people who live there now. The Kalenjin make up around 12% of Kenya's population, and yet they've produced close to 3/4 of the country's elite distance runners, along with nearly 3/8 of every man who has ever won a major world distance title. That's not 12% of the podium showing up. It's nowhere close. Look at the ankles, and some of it starts to click. Noticeably slimmer than average, and in distance running that matters more than almost any other physical trait, because weight at the extremity is the most expensive weight a runner carries. Every extra gram at the ankle costs energy on every single stride, and over the length of a marathon that adds up fast. A lighter lever swings cheaper. Add slow twitch muscle fiber built for endurance rather than sprint power, lung capacity, and oxygen-carrying blood on the high end, and childhood spent living and training between 2,100 and 2,700 meters, where thin air does half the coaching for free every single day. Be careful handing this whole thing to a single gene though, because nobody's actually found one. What's happening looks more like a stack of factors: body shape, environment, culture, probably some inherited traits too, all leaning the same direction across generations. It's a messier story than the myth. It's also a more honest one. The Himba of Namibia don't bathe in water. Most haven't for most of their lives, across generations. And the desert never punished them for it, because they built something else to take water's place. It's called otjize, butterfat and red ochre, worked into skin and hair from childhood through old age. It looks purely decorative. It isn't. Lab tests back up what the Himba already knew from experience. It blocks UV radiation like sunscreen, fights bacteria like an antiseptic, and keeps insects off like a chemical repellent. One paste doing 3 jobs, and nobody needed a laboratory to invent it. Their version of a shower is smoke. Herbs burned over the same coals every household keeps going, passed over the skin instead of water, and their social structure runs 2 lineages at once: patrilineal for land and cattle, matrilineal for spiritual life and clan identity. Neither cancels the other out. A household can trace its cattle rights through the father's side and its ancestral fire through the mother's, at the same time without any contradiction. For the Himba, beauty and survival were never 2 separate problems. It's the same solution, worn on the skin every day. High in the Argentine Andes, at 3,775 meters, there's a village where the drinking water carried around 200 micrograms of arsenic per liter, nearly 20 times the safe limit, right up until filtration finally arrived in 2012. Before that, it was the only water anyone had. Arsenic doesn't compromise. It causes cancer, it shuts organs down slowly. Through toxic byproducts the body struggles to clear fast enough. People have lived on this land for at least 7,000 years, maybe closer to 11,000. So either the water was quietly killing them the entire time, or something in their biology learned to push back. It pushed back. A gene called AS3MT shows up at unusually high frequency in this population, a version that metabolizes arsenic faster and produces far less of the toxic byproduct responsible for the damage elsewhere. Even mummified remains from the region carry arsenic embedded in preserved hair, strand by strand, a chemical record of exposure reaching back generations before anyone had a word for genetics, let alone arsenic. This is the first confirmed case scientists have documented of natural selection in humans responding directly to a chemical toxin. Not a virus, not famine. Poison in the water, quietly deciding who got to have children, for thousands of years, and nobody in that village had any idea why. Surviving poison in your water is one thing. The next stretch of tribes turned diseases and diets that would kill most of us into something their bodies simply shrug off. And by the end of this chapter, you'll meet a tribe that survived a brain-eating epidemic and passed the gene that beat it straight down the line. Milk, blood, meat. That's the traditional Maasai diet, more or less, with vegetables barely entering into it. By every rule modern nutrition has hammered into us for 50 years, this should be a heart attack on a schedule. It isn't. Maasai populations show low blood cholesterol, low rates of heart disease, low rates of gallstones, on a diet loaded with exactly the saturated fat we've been told for decades to avoid. Part of the explanation, found back in 2012, sits in the body's own feedback loop. When dietary cholesterol comes in this steadily, some Maasai bodies dial back their internal production to compensate, roughly the way a thermostat cuts the heat when a room's already warm. Layered on top of that, gene variants tied to lipid metabolism and lactose digestion look like they've been under active, recent selection. Not ancient history, but changes still unfolding within living memory. Don't turn this into a diet trend, though. It's a specific population, specific genes, and a lifetime of physical labor, herding cattle on foot, walking for miles most days. None of it transfers if you copy the menu and skip everything else that comes bundled with it. In 2017, The Lancet published a finding that genuinely startled cardiologists. 85% of the Tsimane studied showed zero coronary plaque, an 80-year-old with arteries that looked, on the scan, like a 50-year-old's in the industrialized world. Not slightly better, decades younger. 3 things seem to be doing the work. They walk around 16 kilometers a day, not as a workout, just as daily life. Roughly 70% of their calories come from unprocessed carbohydrates. And there's almost none of the chronic background stress that grinds down a modern nervous system year after year. Move a Tsimane family into a city, though, and within a single generation, those clean arteries start collecting the same plaque as everyone else's, same genes, dropped into a different world, and the arteries seem to notice the difference almost immediately. It isn't really about the tribe, it's about the world the rest of us decided to build. The Hadza of Tanzania are one of the last true hunter-gatherer populations left on Earth. No farming, no herds, no stockpiles. In 2012, researchers strapped activity monitors on them, fully expecting to find they burned far more energy than someone sitting at a desk with the air conditioning on. They found almost the same number. The result reportedly sat unpublished for a while because it seemed too strange to be real. People walking miles and hunting all day, burning roughly what a desk job burns. The likely explanation isn't magic. Their bodies appear to reroute that saved energy away from chronic low-grade inflammation. The same slow-burning process now linked to heart disease and diabetes across the industrialized world. Their gut carries some of the most diverse microbial life ever recorded in a human population, hundreds of species working the digestive tract at once, many of which have simply vanished from city guts, wiped out by processed food and antibiotics nobody even remembers taking as a kid. There's no stockpiling, no hierarchy, no single person deciding who eats first. Whatever's caught gets shared the same day across the whole camp, meat, honey, whatever the day happened to produce. It isn't written down as policy anywhere. It's just how things have worked for longer than anyone can trace. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, a disease tore through the Fore people that doctors of the time simply couldn't explain. They called it kuru, the laughing death, for the tremors and involuntary laughter that marked its final stage, sometimes appearing years after whatever triggered it. It spread through a funerary practice, eating the brain tissue of the deceased, intended as an act of mourning and respect rather than aggression. That practice ended completely by the 1950s and 60s once its role in spreading the disease became clear. This is history, not something happening now, and it hasn't been for 70 years. Figuring out what kuru actually was took decades. It turned out to be a prion disease, not a virus, not a bacteria, but a misfolded protein that forces healthy proteins nearby to misfold too, spreading like a chain reaction with no cure and, at the time, no explanation whatsoever. Then researchers found something in the survivors, a gene variant called G127V, almost exclusive to the region hit hardest by kuru, and essentially never found in anyone who died from it. It appears to block prions from replicating, and lab studies suggest it might even resist prion diseases the Fore never actually encountered. Researchers genotyped more than 3,000 people from the region to confirm the pattern held. Geneticists have called it one of the strongest, fastest cases of natural selection ever documented in humans, evolution compressed into a handful of generations, driven by nothing but survival. Central African rainforest populations, sometimes referred to as pygmy peoples, average around 150 to 155 centimeters as adults. Here's the part that gets missed constantly. This has nothing to do with malnutrition. Kids are born at typical size, grow at a typical pace, and then growth simply stops earlier than usual, driven by naturally lower levels of a growth hormone called IGF-1. This isn't a body that failed to develop. It's a body that finished developing for a different job entirely, moving fast through dense canopy, climbing with a speed and control that would put most trained athletes to shame, needing less food in an environment where food takes real, constant effort to find. Generation after generation, smaller simply turned out to be the more efficient shape. The same forest, incidentally, produces its own pygmy elephants, pygmy hippos, and pygmy buffalo, evolution running roughly the same experiment on multiple species within the same stretch of jungle. Some communities still hold the Molimo ceremony, understood as waking the forest itself, not scenery, something owed genuine respect. But some tribes didn't just adapt their bodies to their surroundings. A few of them seem to have stepped almost entirely outside of time and rewrote what a human mind is even capable of. For decades, the Hunza Valley in Pakistan carried a reputation as the place where people didn't seem to age, stories of residents living well past 100 with nothing much wrong with them. Modern researchers have pushed back hard on the exact numbers. Without formal birth records, some of those ages were probably rounded up by legend a long time ago, and it's fair to be skeptical. Here's what wasn't exaggerated, though. Cardiovascular disease and cancer rates in the valley run remarkably low, and blood pressure in Hunza elders in their 70s has been recorded looking closer to a 40-year-old's elsewhere. 4 things line up: dried apricots and homegrown vegetables, daily movement across genuinely rough terrain, seasonal stretches of eating much less out of necessity, and a pace of life without the chronic stress that wears a body down over decades. That seasonal scarcity is essentially intermittent fasting, just forced by the calendar instead of chosen at a gym. The same practice longevity labs study today for its effect on cellular aging, except the Hunza have simply lived it as how a year works, for longer than anyone's kept count. The myth promised immortality. The truth is smaller, and somehow still more impressive, a life tuned almost perfectly to keep a heart young. In the mountains of northern Pakistan, a population with blue eyes and blonde or light brown hair stands out sharply against everyone around them. For generations, the story told was that they descended from soldiers in Alexander the Great's army, stranded here more than 2,000 years ago. DNA testing killed that story outright. The Kalash aren't descendants of Greek soldiers. They're something rarer, an ancient population that split off from other South Asian lineages roughly 12,000 years ago and stayed isolated ever since, valley by valley. Geneticists describe their genome as close to a frozen snapshot, a photograph of a world and a population that no longer exists anywhere else on the map. They're polytheistic, they make their own wine, and they hold music and dance festivals in a region where alcohol is otherwise rare, much of it centered on communal spaces called bashali, where women gather during certain rites away from the rest of the village. It isn't a story about ancient warriors who washed up in the mountains and stayed. It's something better, a population that never merged into anyone else's story and never needed to borrow one from Alexander to explain what it already was. Genetic studies place the San peoples of southern Africa among the oldest continuous human lineages alive, a line that split off from the rest of us more than 150,000 years ago and never broke. Geneticists have a specific name for what that makes them, the closest living link to what every human population once was, before any of the branches split apart. Watch a sand tracker read a trail, and the deep time starts to make sense. Given 3 days, they can follow a single animal's path across ground that looks like nothing to an untrained eye, a bent blade of grass, a shifted stone, the depth and spacing of a print revealing whether the animal was limping or startled, calm or afraid, which way it turned and why. Their language holds something no other language family has preserved at this depth: click consonants, dental, palatal, lateral, each one a distinct sound carrying distinct meaning, woven into ordinary conversation. If you've never heard it spoken, sit with that for a second. An entire spoken architecture, tens of thousands of years deep, that most of humanity has never once encountered. They've been pushed off their own land generation after generation, and they're still fighting through courts today to get parts of it back. Not a relic, not a museum piece, still standing, still tracking, still speaking a language older than most of what gets called history. The pirahã of the Brazilian Amazon sleep in short bursts, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, night after night. It isn't insomnia, it's belief. Deep sleep to the pirahã is dangerous, a kind of death that erases who you were, which is also why they rename themselves throughout life whenever they've genuinely become someone different. The language is stranger still. No numbers, no abstract color words, no grammatical past or future tense, only what's happening right now or what someone still alive personally witnessed. Linguist Daniel Everett lived among them for years and came away arguing that pirahã directly challenges Noam Chomsky's theory of a universal grammar wired into every human brain. That debate still isn't settled, even among the people who study language for a living. The language doesn't even require speech to function. It can be whistled, hummed, sung, carrying full meaning across long distances through dense forest, sometimes in the middle of the night when talking normally would carry too far and give away a position. What comes next is the tribe this entire list has been building toward, the one that heard a warning inside the sea itself, a warning no instrument built by modern science managed to catch in time. The Moken, sometimes called sea gypsies, spend 8 or 9 months of most years living on boats called kabang, moving through the Andaman Sea. They read currents, wind, the color of the seafloor, the position of the stars, with a precision that beats most instruments because their knowledge was built here and nowhere else on Earth. On December 26, 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami killed roughly 228,000 people across a dozen countries. A magnitude 9.1 earthquake, one of the largest ever recorded. Seismographs caught it. Satellites existed. The warning still didn't reach most coastlines in time. The Moken didn't need a satellite. They watched the sea pull back further than it should, exposing seabed that never normally shows. Dolphins swam out toward deeper water instead of staying near shore. Elephants moved to higher ground on their own, before anyone led them there. Birds changed their flight patterns all at once, all in the same direction. Their oral tradition carries a legend called Laboon, the wave that eats people, passed down as a survival manual disguised as a bedtime story. When the signs lined up the way the legend described, they didn't wait around for confirmation from anyone. They moved to high ground immediately. Nearly the entire community survived a wave that erased towns and resorts around them within minutes. Science, with every satellite and sensor at its disposal, couldn't warn 228,000 people in time. A story, carried by memory alone for 1,000 years, saved almost an entire community in minutes. And that knowledge is disappearing now. Resettlement programs have pushed many Moken families into fixed housing on land, and younger generations are growing up without ever learning to read the sea the way their grandparents did. A library that took 1,000 years to write is closing, one generation at a time. 15 tribes. 15 proofs of just how extraordinary a human body and a human mind can become, not despite hardship, but because of it. None of this is strangeness. It's mastery, earned the hard way, over thousands of years none of us were around to see. Here's the harder part to sit with. Every one of these traits, the spleen that stores oxygen like a seal's, arteries that never clog, blood that shrugs off arsenic, a gene that beat a disease with no cure, was paid for across generations of people who didn't live long enough to pass anything down themselves. And the comfortable, sealed-off world the rest of us built is quietly erasing what took those generations to write. 2 generations on land, and a Bajau spleen shrinks back down. 1 generation in a city, and a Tsimane artery starts clogging like everyone else's. Maybe the real question isn't how these tribes got so remarkable. Maybe it's what convenience has actually been costing the rest of us this whole time. 1 comfortable decade after another, 1 generation that never had to walk 16 kilometers a day, never had to read a trail, never had to fast because the season demanded it. Human evolution never stopped. It's running right now, under your own skin, and you'll probably never notice it happening, not because it's slow, but because the pressure that used to drive it has mostly vanished wherever you happen to live. Would we still be evolving in a dozen different directions if we'd never built cities at all? Or did the world we made already answer that question for us? Tell us which tribe changed how you think about what a human being can be.